Picture this: you're standing in a bustling medieval marketplace. The air smells of fresh bread and wood smoke. You hear blacksmiths hammering, merchants shouting, and the clatter of horses on cobblestones. But amid all that noise, one big question hangs in the air. How did all these workers actually get paid? There were no bank transfers, no paychecks, not even coins for many of them. So how did the whole economy function? Let's take a journey back in time and find out. When we think of getting paid, we usually imagine a number in our bank account, but for most people in the Middle Ages, roughly between the 5th and 15th centuries, money wasn't the main way work was rewarded. It was a world built on land, loyalty, and labor. And depending on who you were, a farmer, craftsman, soldier, or servant, your salary could mean something very different. Let's start with peasants, the backbone of medieval society. Most of them didn't get wages at all. They worked on land owned by a lord, part of a system we call feudalism. In exchange for working the lord's fields, maintaining his roads, and helping with harvests, peasants were allowed to live on a small plot of land and farm it for themselves. They paid their rent, not in coins, but in crops, animals, or labor. For example, a farmer might owe his lord 3 days of work every week on the manor's land. On the other days, he could tend his own small fields. So his payment wasn't in money. It was in survival. He got to keep a portion of his harvest, and in return the lord protected him from bandits or rival lords. Now, this might sound unfair, and in many ways, it was. But it worked because everyone depended on one another. Lords needed peasants to grow food. Peasants needed lords to provide security. It was an economy based on obligation and exchange, not cash. However, not all medieval workers were tied to the land. In towns and cities, things were very different. With the rise of trade in the 11th and 12th centuries, a new kind of worker emerged: the craftsmen. These were people who made things: blacksmiths, carpenters, bakers, weavers, and masons. Their world revolved around guilds, organizations that set the rules for each trade. Guilds protected the quality of work, controlled prices, and made sure members were paid fairly. A young person who wanted to learn a trade began as an apprentice. An apprentice usually lived with a master craftsman, learned the skills of the trade, and worked for free, or nearly free, for several years. Instead of money, the apprentice was given food, shelter, and training. You could think of it as a long internship that might last 7 years or more. Once the apprentice finished, they became a journeyman, a worker who could earn wages and travel from place to place looking for work. Only after proving exceptional skill could they become a master themselves, often by creating a masterpiece to show the guild. Journeymen were among the first kinds of medieval workers who regularly got paid in cash. They might receive coins for each project or each day worked. Payment wasn't standardized. Sometimes it was in silver pennies, sometimes in goods like food or clothing. But it was a step toward the wage system we know today. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine being a stonemason building a cathedral in the 13th century. You'd probably be working 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset, carving and lifting massive blocks of stone. Your pay might come every Saturday, a few silver coins handed out by the master mason. But that money didn't go far. You had to pay for your tools, your food, and maybe a small room to sleep in. Still, those coins represented independence. You weren't bound to a lord or manor. You could take your skills and move to another town. For many workers, that was freedom. But there's another side to this story. For centuries, money was scarce. Coins were made of precious metals, and most peasants rarely saw any. That's why payments in kind, meaning goods instead of money, were so common. A shepherd might be paid with a portion of wool. A carpenter might be rewarded with meals, or even a new pair of boots. It was a barter economy where value was negotiated in things rather than numbers. In large estates and castles, servants worked directly for noble families. Some were paid small stipends in coin, but many were compensated through room, board, and clothing. A maid might live in the manor, eat the lord's food, and wear simple uniforms provided by the household. Her payment was that she didn't have to worry about rent or food, though she had little personal freedom. Skilled servants like cooks, falconers, or scribes often earned extra privileges or small cash bonuses for special work. In a sense, medieval employers mixed salary, perks, and benefits long before those words existed. Of course, not every worker was part of a peaceful estate or workshop. Soldiers, for example, had a completely different pay structure. Medieval armies weren't full-time organizations like today's militaries. Many soldiers were mercenaries, hired fighters paid in coin, loot, or land. During wartime, kings or nobles promised soldiers a daily wage, often paid after a campaign ended. For example, during the 100 Years' War, English archers might earn 6 pence a day. But payment could be delayed for months, and sometimes soldiers simply took what they wanted from the lands they marched through. In other cases, a knight might serve his lord in exchange for land rather than money, a reward that could last generations. So, for warriors, payment might mean a bag of silver or a castle to call home. Religion also played a role in how people were compensated. Many monks and nuns worked long hours, farming, copying manuscripts, brewing ale, or making cheese. But they didn't earn wages at all. Their payment was spiritual food, shelter, and the promise of salvation. In a world deeply shaped by faith, that was often enough. Monasteries, however, became rich institutions, managing large estates and hiring lay workers who were paid in coins or goods. This mix of sacred labor and economic practicality was one of the reasons monasteries were so influential in medieval society. Now, something major changed after the Black Death in the 14th century. The plague killed millions across Europe, wiping out nearly half the population in some areas. Suddenly, there weren't enough workers. Farms went untended, towns struggled to rebuild, and those who survived found themselves in high demand. For the first time, peasants had bargaining power. They could demand higher wages or better treatment, and many left their lords' lands to seek paid work elsewhere. This shift marked the beginning of the end for the old feudal system. The authorities weren't happy about it. In England, for instance, King Edward III passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351. It tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and punish workers who asked for more pay. But people had tasted independence, and there was no going back. Over time, cash wages became the norm for many types of work, especially in towns. The medieval world was moving, slowly but surely, toward a money-based economy. Still, payment wasn't always fair or regular. There were no labor laws, no minimum wage, no safety nets. A bad harvest could mean hunger. A dishonest employer could refuse to pay. Workers often relied on trust, reputation, and community pressure to make sure promises were kept. That's one reason guilds and local councils were so important. They protected workers' rights long before modern unions existed. By the late Middle Ages, the picture was changing fast. Markets grew, trade routes expanded, and coins circulated more widely. Merchants hired assistants, shipbuilders employed crews, and cities developed complex payment systems. Even peasants began earning small amounts of money from selling surplus crops or crafts. The simple barter system was giving way to something more familiar. A society where your labor could be measured, priced, and paid for. It's fascinating to think that our entire modern idea of getting a paycheck every month began as a mix of labor obligations, food rations, and silver coins handed out in a muddy marketplace. But beyond the economics, there's something deeply human about it. Medieval workers, just like us, wanted security, respect, and a fair return for their effort. Whether it was a mason carving stone, a peasant tilling the soil, or a maid scrubbing a floor, they all contributed to the rhythm of life that built castles, cathedrals, and cities that still stand today. If you could travel back to the 13th century and ask a blacksmith, "How do you get paid?" he might look at you strangely. Then he'd probably point to a sack of